Here is something that should not have been possible. Camilla is the queen. She wears the crown. She rides in the carriages. She sits beside the king at every state occasion. And yet a woman who will never be queen, who holds no place in the line of succession, and had nothing whatsoever to gain from any of this, was standing in a corridor inside Buckingham Palace, listening to Camilla ask her for a small favor, and she said no. Princess Anne did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Camilla made one last appeal to stop Catherine from walking through the doors of the throne room, and Anne answered her with a silence so cold that the two members of staff at the far end of the corridor suddenly became very interested in the carpet. Then Camilla looked at the crimson folder in Anne's left hand and asked what was written on the last page, and Anne did not tell her. What Anne did in the 30 seconds that followed put her on the front page of every British newspaper the next morning. The national broadcaster opened its evening bulletin with her. A crowd gathered outside the palace gates, and when you see what it actually was, you will understand why the country reacted that way. Because it takes about 4 seconds to look at it, and it says everything without a word of explanation. We will get there. But this was never about a room, or a ceremony, or a family disagreement. It was about that folder, and about the one page inside it that Camilla was not permitted to read. What was written on that page is the reason all of this happened in the first place. If you want to follow this story as it develops, you already know where the subscribe button is. A quick word before we go further. My name is Harold. I spend my time going through everything connected to this family, the archives, the official records, the stories that were buried before anyone finished asking questions. What you are about to hear is me putting the pieces together the way I read them. Stay with me until the end, because it is on that last page where everything finally lands. Let me give you the context, because the way this unraveled is honestly the most interesting part of it. It did not happen at some glamorous public event with cameras everywhere. It happened on an ordinary weekday morning, in a corridor on the first floor of Buckingham Palace. No press group nearby. 3 names on the movement sheet: Anne, Catherine, and one senior private secretary who was carrying nothing at all. Camilla was not on that sheet. She came anyway. She reached them with about 20 feet of corridor to spare, and she asked for a delay, not a cancellation. That detail is worth holding, because it tells you she already knew she had lost the bigger argument. She said the timing was wrong. She said the country was watching the king's health and counting the days between his engagements, and that walking the Princess of Wales into that room in that particular week would not look like preparation to anyone watching. It would look like replacement. Camilla used that word herself, replacement, and standing right there beside them, the future queen said nothing at all. Think about where Catherine actually was in that moment, between a woman asking for her humiliation to be postponed and a woman about to make it permanent. No folder in her hands, no notes, no title giving her any right to be in that room. And every extra second on that carpet made her the center of a confrontation she had never once asked to lead. Anne did not soften, not by a fraction. She told the queen consort that this decision no longer belonged to her, not to her pride, not to her fear, and not to her household. A confidential royal council, a small group of senior family members and advisors who quietly prepare the monarchy for decisions nobody wants to announce, had already approved the briefing. Catherine was going in because the responsibilities she will carry beside William now require her to hold information that had previously stopped at the king and the small group closest to him. And then Anne said the sentence that ended the conversation. Charles had signed the instruction himself. That single fact changed everything standing in that corridor. The king's own order gave Catherine immediate access to the planning that keeps the crown running during illness, during crisis, during any moment when the person wearing it cannot perform the role. Camilla heard the words, but what actually wounded her was not the access itself. It was the discovery that her husband had made that decision without giving her any opportunity to stop it. Catherine looked toward Anne, and Anne answered with one small, certain gesture. In her left hand rested the crimson folder, household stationery, the kind used for private declarations that never go near a press office. Inside it, a formal written order setting out the whole new arrangement and clipped separately, folded once, sitting behind everything else. One page that Camilla had not been shown. She asked what was on it. Anne did not answer her. And this is the part I keep returning to, because it tells you how far past ordinary family tension this had already traveled. Camilla was not afraid of the rejection itself. She had absorbed that standing right there in the corridor. She was afraid of the page. Whatever was written on it frightened her more than anything else that had happened to her that morning, and she had no way to find out what it said. The corridor went completely quiet, and in those few seconds, standing there with no answer coming, Camilla finally understood something that had been true for weeks without her seeing any of it. This was not a spontaneous act of support from a sister-in-law. This was enforcement. Somebody had built the case, gathered the paperwork, secured the king's signature, and chosen Anne as the one person in that family strong enough to carry it through to the end. Camilla had not lost an argument in a corridor. She had lost a campaign she never knew was running. And what Anne did next in front of 2 aides and 1 camera nobody had accounted for is the thing I promised you at the start. I'm going to hold it a little longer, because if I show it to you now, it is just a woman walking down a hallway, and you will not understand why an entire country reacted the way it did. To understand that, you have to know what all 3 of these women were carrying that morning. To understand why Anne chose Catherine over Camilla without a moment of hesitation, you have to understand what each of them was actually facing. Behind the titles and the ceremonies and the careful palace language, you had 3 women looking at 3 completely different futures. Camilla was afraid of being pushed to the edge of a world she had spent decades fighting to get inside. Catherine was afraid of becoming the public symbol of another woman's defeat. And Anne was facing the hardest position of the 3, protecting the peace inside her own family, or protecting the future of the crown from a fracture she had decided could not be ignored for 1 more week. Anne first, because people constantly misread her, and she is the reason this story has an ending rather than a rumor. She has never built her place in that family around applause. 5 decades of choosing service over comfort. Hundreds of engagements a year in weather nobody photographs. For organizations nobody covers. Her children carry no royal titles because she turned them down on their behalf. That is precisely what made her the only person in that building capable of enforcing a decision like this one. There is no version of this story in which Anne gained a single thing from it. She had decided that one private act of jealousy could weaken public trust and damage the order William would inherit. And once she decided that, she was never going to undecide it. Catherine was carrying something completely different. Years of disciplined public service had already prepared her to stand beside a future king, and yet every new responsibility handed to her seemed to deepen Camilla's fear, and she could feel that happening in every room. She told William in a conversation that later got written down that she did not want another woman publicly diminished in her name. She meant it because she married into a family that had already done that once. She has spent her entire marriage being measured against a woman who died in 1997, compared in every photograph and every gesture, and she knows exactly what this institution does when it decides a woman is being replaced. She wanted no part of doing it to somebody else. But she also could not walk away from duties that will one day affect her husband, her children, and the stability of the whole institution. She was caught between 2 things she believed in, and there was no clean way through it. And then there is Camilla. I want to be fair to her here, because the version of this story where she is nothing but a villain is the lazy version, and it is also wrong. Camilla finally admitted the truth to Charles behind closed doors. In a documented account of that exchange, she told him that her position seemed to shrink every time the younger royal walked into a room. Listen to what she was describing, because it is more painful than simple jealousy. No decree had replaced her. No title had been removed. Nothing on paper had changed at all. But attention moved toward Catherine. Advisors listened to Catherine a little more closely. The queen consort could feel the future arriving in that building, while she was nowhere near ready to let go of the present. Charles heard the fear underneath her words. He has known this woman for the better part of 50 years. But he also recognized the danger sitting inside that fear, and this is where he made his first mistake. He had spent decades trying to hold loyalty, marriage, and duty together in the same hand, and those three things had finally begun pulling apart. So he offered reassurance. He told her what she needed to hear, and he very carefully did not promise to block Catherine's preparation. You have to understand why Charles goes quiet in rooms like that one, because it is the same reason he has gone quiet in every difficult room of his adult life. The last time this family had to choose publicly between two women, it ended with a coffin in Westminster Abbey and a nation that has never fully forgiven him. He has spent almost 30 years managing that. So when the choice came around again in a smaller form with lower stakes, he did the only thing he has ever known how to do with it. He said nothing and hoped it would pass. That silence is the hinge of this entire story. Camilla walked out of that room feeling exposed, with no idea where she actually stood. It pushed her toward a decision she would spend months regretting. Meanwhile, Anne had already started writing things down. Inside a handwritten journal, she had begun listing the moments where private rivalry was interfering with official planning. Delayed briefings, altered placements, dates and initials, and what happened when. No emails, no digital trail, nothing a household audit could ever pull. She wrote it out by hand like a woman who expected to be asked to prove it one day and expected that proving to be difficult. That record was not gossip. It was a timeline, and several entries on it pointed directly at Camilla's office. Then William found the last piece, and it changed what this was. Last week on this channel, I covered what William found in the car belonging to Camilla's son, and how quietly the household handled it. Many of you came into the comments asking the same question. What happens the next time he finds something? This is that video. And the second time around, he did not take it to his father at all. He took it to his aunt. What he had was a confidential note showing that the queen consort had asked for the throne room briefing to be postponed until after a private legal review. Reasonable enough on the surface. Households write notes like that constantly, except for one detail that took William about 4 seconds to notice. Charles had authorized no such review. No law officer had been instructed. No file existed anywhere. That review had been invented, and it had been invented to buy time. That is the line. Everyone who saw the note understood it the moment they read it. Delaying a briefing because your husband is unwell is a wife being protective. Delaying a briefing by pointing at a legal process that does not exist is something else entirely. This was no longer insecurity. This was interference, and it was interference in writing. But the actual point of no return had come earlier than that, weeks earlier, during a ceremony that exists specifically to show the world a united royal family. And it came down to one altered instruction and a single card that somebody swapped. The final confrontation did not begin outside the throne room at all. It began weeks before, underneath the polished surface of a major royal ceremony where every movement had been rehearsed and every position carried meaning. One changed instruction placed Catherine behind Camilla, separated her from William, and quietly removed her from a duty Charles had personally assigned. Anne watched it happen with her own eyes, and from that moment she began preparing for what was coming. Catherine arrived at the Commonwealth Service rehearsal expecting two things: to stand beside William during the procession, and to receive a sealed briefing from senior household officials afterward. That service takes place at Westminster Abbey on the second Monday of March, with high commissioners and flag bearers from 56 nations in one building, and every position inside it carries weight. The order people walk in signals rank, responsibility, and above all, who currently holds the monarch's confidence. The photographers know the plan before they arrive. They know exactly which frame sells. Minutes before the rehearsal began, an aide came down the aisle carrying a revised placement card. Camilla's private approval was on the instruction. Catherine was moved several places back, out of the pairing with her husband and behind the queen consort, and her briefing was reassigned to another member of the family. The queen consort's office called it a necessary adjustment. But look at what that one card actually did. It pushed Catherine away from William in the one procession that year, where the entire Commonwealth was watching. It weakened her role in front of the diplomatic corps and the press, and it proved something Camilla needed to prove, mostly to herself, which is that responsibilities handed out by Charles could be quietly taken back without Charles finding out. Catherine did not protest. Nobody in that family argues inside an abbey with 40 members of staff within earshot. She read the card, folded the original in half, placed it inside her handbag, and kept her face completely calm while the morning settled over her. Anne watched her fold that card, sit with that image for a moment, because it is the hinge of this story. Anne has watched royal duty demand sacrifice from people her whole life. She has done it herself, over and over, without complaint and without a camera crew following her. Sacrifice for the institution she understands. She has never once objected to it, but this was different, and she knew it instantly. There was no protocol behind that card, no precedence rule, no requirement of any kind. Catherine was being diminished by somebody else's fear, and the fear had learned to write in the language of official paperwork. Anne moved quickly. In a documented account, later prepared for Charles, she went straight to the aide and asked who had authorized the change. The answer came with some hesitation, which tells you the aide already understood there was a problem. The instruction had passed through Camilla's office under the phrase visual hierarchy, which is a real term officials use for the public order that shows the country who ranks where. It is also, when used the way it was used that morning, a tidy way to remove somebody from a room while claiming you were only arranging furniture. And the king had approved no such alteration. Not verbally, not in writing, not through his private secretary. Charles read both placement cards that evening. He studied the original, then the replacement, and set them down on the desk without saying a single word. The people who work near that man will tell you that the silence carried anger, but it also carried shame. He had personally assigned Catherine that briefing, and somebody inside his own household had overridden his instruction without asking him. Anne requested a confidential review of every change made to Catherine's duties over the previous 6 months. The review went through internal schedules, approvals, and message traffic that the palace never releases to anyone. 2 officials ran it, and neither of them worked for Camilla. What they found was not a mistake, or a misunderstanding, or a scheduling clash. It was a pattern. Delayed briefings, altered placements, messages diverted away from Catherine's office and read by somebody else first. Repeated efforts to narrow her access to senior advisors. Meeting requests answered with a reference to a review when no review existed anywhere. All of it inside 6 months. All of it pointing at one office. Armed with documents Camilla never expected her to see, Anne walked into a private room and made the queen consort answer for every one of them. The door closed with no aides, no secretaries, and no family anywhere near it. Anne had asked for the meeting without saying what it was about. She got there first. She laid the altered schedules on the table between them. the original card and the replacement side by side, the delayed briefings, the diverted messages, and the note about the legal review that did not exist, sitting face up on top of the pile. Then she asked Camilla one question. How many times had she interfered with Catherine's duties without the king's knowledge? Camilla tried to defend herself, and did not move, did not blink, and did not let the conversation escape into excuses. For once in that building, the masks were gone. Camilla pushed the papers aside and insisted she had been protecting stability around the king. She said Catherine's rise was moving too fast, while Charles remained active and under enormous pressure, that the household was running him too hard, that the press was counting his engagements like a countdown clock, and that competing centers of attention inside one family could damage his authority at exactly the moment he needed it most. I will give her this. That is the argument a competent private secretary would make. If she had put it in writing to the king on the record, it would have been a legitimate position and might well have won. She made it after the fact instead, to explain months of changes she had never disclosed, and to cover a legal review she had invented. That is the difference between an argument and a cover story. Anne said so to her face. Anne answered with controlled fury, which is somehow worse than shouting. Protecting Charles did not require humiliating another woman inside an abbey. It certainly did not require blocking duties he had personally approved. And then she said the thing Camilla could not answer because it was true and because it cost Anne nothing to say out loud. The Princess Royal has no desire to be queen. She has never once shown the slightest interest in moving closer to the throne. She had nothing to gain from that conversation, nothing at all, except the survival of a system she has served her entire adult life. That is exactly what gave her the force she had in that room. Camilla finally broke under it, not into tears, from everything I can find, into detail. In a recorded account of that private exchange, she admitted asking for the throne room meeting to be postponed. And then she explained why. And this is the part that made me sit back when I first put it together. Catherine was not going into that room for an introduction. She was due to receive a confidential continuity plan, a private document explaining who carries which key responsibilities if the monarch suddenly becomes too ill to act. That briefing would place the younger royal deep inside decisions that Camilla had always believed belonged to Charles and the small circle closest to him. Camilla had sat through that briefing herself. She knew exactly what was in it, and she knew exactly what it would mean once somebody else knew it too. What follows is my read of her thinking, not something anybody has confirmed. But watch what she does immediately afterward, because her actions say more here than any statement could. Camilla was not trying to stop a ceremony. She was trying to delay the transfer of the one advantage she had left, which was being the only woman in that family who already knew the plan. Anne let the confession sit in the air for a moment. Then she delivered the part Camilla had not worked out. The king already knew. He had read the request. He had recognized exactly what was inside it. He had rejected it outright, and he had authorized his own sister to make sure Catherine entered that throne room without one further day of delay. No household office, no private appeal, no emotional warning from anyone was going to reverse that order. Camilla rose slowly from her chair, and on her way out, she gave one final warning. The closest thing this story has to a threat. Anne might control the doorway, she said, but the real decision did not rest with her. It rested inside that crimson folder, underneath the final page, under a signature that neither of them could argue with. And she was right about that. She had absolutely no idea how right she was, because days before any of that happened, Charles had been sitting alone with the crimson folder open in front of him, reading the same paragraph for the third time and not signing anything at all. I want to slow down here because everyone wants Charles to be either the villain of this story or the hero of it. He is honestly neither. He is the man who created the whole problem by refusing to have one difficult conversation with his wife. And he is also the man who then had to solve it with a pen, knowing exactly what it would cost her. The decision in front of him was not about affection or revenge. It was about continuity, the machinery that keeps the monarchy running when illness takes the sovereign out of action. Nobody in Britain paid that machinery much attention for decades, right up until it stopped being theoretical. Two things made it real. In November 2022, Charles wrote to the House of Lords on his own birthday, asking Parliament to widen the small group of people legally allowed to stand in for him. The BBC reported it at the time. That bill went through in weeks and added Anne and Edward to the list. Then, in February 2024, Buckingham Palace announced that the king had cancer. Every abstract question about who steps in and who knows what turned into a live problem overnight. And it stayed live. The document in front of Charles that evening had a dry title, a Royal Continuity Directive. It does one job. It explains who receives sensitive briefings and who carries which duties if the monarch becomes unable to act, so that nobody spends the first day of a national emergency arguing about authority. Catherine's inclusion did not make her sovereign. It did not move her one place in the succession. It did not hand her a title or a signature or any legal power. It prepared her for responsibilities she will one day carry beside William, and that is all it did. Charles rested his hand beside the final page and did not sign it. William came in while he was still sitting there and chose every word with care because he understood how fragile that room was. He told his father that Catherine did not seek Camilla's place, had never asked to be moved forward, and had never once asked to be used as a symbol against her. His wife would carry whatever the institution needed her to carry, the way she always had. Then he put the problem somewhere. His father could not step around it. Catherine cannot protect the monarchy while being denied the knowledge she needs to serve it. Their children, their future reign, the stability of the crown, all of it depends on preparation starting before a crisis rather than during one. And you already know why William thinks in exactly those terms. He was 15 years old when he buttoned a dark suit and walked behind his mother's coffin through the streets of London, while the entire planet watched him do it. A boy learned something that week that his father never had to learn at that age. The institution will let you walk through the worst day of your life completely unprepared. It will film every second of it, and it will never stop to ask whether anybody got you ready. He was not going to let that happen to his wife. Charles looked back down at the document and felt the weight of both women at once. Camilla would never see a neutral instruction on that page. She would see rejection delivered on paper from the husband whose reign she had struggled for 18 years to enter. But Catherine would see something equally damaging if he refused to sign it. She would see proof that duty in this family can be blocked by somebody's private fear, even when the future of the whole institution demands clarity. The king picked up the pen. His signature approved Catherine's briefing, effective immediately, with no further delay permitted for any reason. But the second instruction carried more force than the first. It gave Anne the authority to enforce the meeting without delay, not to advise on it, not to attend it, to enforce it. It made his own sister the personal guardian of the decision, which meant no private office, no emotional appeal, and no last-minute request from anyone could overrule her. Standing in front of Anne now meant standing in front of the king. Think about what a choice like that says about what Charles had concluded about his own wife. He did not write her a letter asking her to stop. He appointed somebody to make sure she couldn't, and then he turned to the final page. Camilla had spent days frightened of that page, and she was right to be, because it was the only part of the whole document written specifically about her. It stated that all unauthorized interference with Catherine's duties must end immediately. From the moment of signature, any future change to her schedule, her ceremonial position, or her access to senior advisors would require the monarch's written approval. Written, not a phone call, not a note passed through an office, not a phrase like necessary adjustment handed to an aide 8 minutes before a rehearsal. That one word closed the hidden route completely. Every single thing Camilla had done over those 6 months had traveled down exactly that road. A verbal instruction here, an office approval there, a card handed to an aide inside an abbey. None of it had ever needed the king's signature before, which is precisely why it worked. Charles sealed that road in one sentence. William watched his father set the pen down and understood what had changed. The king had finally chosen action after months of managing the problem instead of solving it. But there was no relief in it for anyone. Because somewhere else in that building, his wife was about to learn that the man she had trusted for 50 years had protected the monarchy without warning her first. The ink had barely dried before it reached her. Camilla received the news in a private sitting room where an aide placed a copy of the directive beside a cup of tea she never touched. She read the final page once, then read it again. Then she removed her glasses and asked whether Charles had truly authorized every line of it. The answer came softly and landed with brutal force. He had. In that instant, the throne room doors became something more than polished wood. They became the boundary between the influence she had spent her entire adult life acquiring and the authority she could no longer reach. Camilla held those pages while the full meaning settled over her. The directive ended her power to alter Catherine's schedule, her ceremonial position, or her access to the senior advisors who guide the monarch on state business. Private household influence could no longer touch the preparation for William's reign, and everyone in that building understood it within a day. The consequences spread through the household almost immediately. From that morning, any challenge involving the Princess of Wales had to go directly to Charles, to William, or to Anne. No private message from the Queen Consort's office could quietly replace something the king had already approved. 20 years of soft power ended in a memo about paperwork. Camilla felt all of it as betrayal long before she was able to understand it as discipline, and she asked the question that had been sitting underneath everything. Why had her husband trusted his sister to enforce this instead of speaking to her himself before he signed it? That question carried years inside it. She had fought for acceptance beside Charles through a level of public hatred that would have broken almost anyone. She had waited out the scandals and the documentaries and the polling, and then, when the greatest threat to her position arrived, he chose silence and paperwork over one honest conversation. Charles came to see her later and did not defend the delay. In a documented account of that conversation, he admitted he had avoided the problem because confronting his wife meant reopening a wound in that marriage that has never fully closed, and you already know whose name sits underneath it. But his hesitation let resentment grow in the dark for months. It damaged the trust between the two women and put the family's own preparations at risk while he managed his own discomfort. And then Camilla learned the detail that unsettled her more than the directive itself. During the review, Catherine had privately asked that no public announcement be made about any of it, and had insisted the changes focus on duty rather than blame, specifically to protect the older woman's charitable work and her public standing. Mercy cut deeper than punishment would have, because the person she had spent months treating as a rival had been handed a clean shot at humiliating her and refused to take it. Catherine could have let those findings run. Someone would have leaked them inside a fortnight, and the front pages would have written themselves for 6 months. She chose restraint instead, and it left the Queen Consort with nowhere left to hide from her own fear. The official struggle ended there. The personal wound did not, and the two of them still had to sit in a room together with no Charles, no Anne, and no palace rules standing between them. Away from the sealed folders and the royal authority, this became what it had always been underneath. One frightened woman talking to another. Catherine came in alone. No officials to record the conversation. No relatives to interrupt it when it got uncomfortable. Camilla stood over by the window, wounded and defensive and uncertain whether the younger woman had come to collect a victory. Instead, Catherine placed the altered placement card on the table between them. The original, the one she had folded in half in that abbey and carried in her handbag through the entire review, and she said she had not kept it as evidence of her humiliation. She kept it as a reminder of the kind of future queen she never wants to become. By then, Catherine had already received the throne room briefing and understood the weight Charles had put on her shoulders, but she had also worked out the thing Camilla had spent months missing, which is that power taken through another woman's shame will poison whatever it was supposed to protect. Camilla looked at the card, and for the first time in this story, she stopped defending herself. In a privately documented account of that meeting, she admitted that every increase in Catherine's authority had felt like proof of her own disappearance. She had fought so long to get inside that reign that she could no longer tell the difference between a woman preparing for the next one and a woman erasing her from this one. She mistook preparation for a threat to her survival, and it cost her everything. Catherine answered quietly. She said dignity cannot be protected by taking dignity away from somebody else. She said she would accept every duty required of her, and she would not allow a single one of them to be turned into a weapon against Camilla. She meant it because the future queen is afraid of power too. Not because she wants less responsibility, but because responsibility without restraint turns service into cruelty. And she has watched exactly that happen inside this family before. Then Camilla's expression changed because Catherine told her about the choice she had already made. She had asked Charles to preserve the older woman's charitable patronages and her public program. Those patronages are not decoration. Camilla's work on domestic abuse and rape crisis support goes back years, and the organizations behind it depend on that association. Catherine had separated Camilla's real service from the interference Anne exposed and refused to erase 2 decades of work because fear had corrupted one part of it. Camilla admitted authorizing the change in that abbey. She did not blame an aide. She did not hide behind palace procedure. The recorded account notes that she apologized without a single qualification attached to it and accepted that her fear had turned into an abuse of access. For the first time in any of this, the queen consort did not ask to be protected from the consequences of her own decision. Catherine did not offer easy forgiveness. She offered a boundary instead. Respect would remain. Duty would continue. Interference would not. Camilla accepted those terms because she finally understood that the younger woman had not walked into that room to defeat her. But a truce like that could never stay hidden. And now I owe you the thing I held back at the start, because within a day, one photograph decided how the entire country would understand every bit of this. Here is what Anne did in that corridor after she refused to answer. She turned away from the queen. She extended her hand toward Catherine, and she walked her through the doors of the throne room herself, in front of 2 aides and 1 lens nobody had accounted for. That is the whole photograph. Anne moving forward with Catherine beside her and Camilla several steps behind them, standing completely still beneath the archway. No argument in it, no document visible, nobody shouting at anybody. And by breakfast the next morning, every person in Britain was looking at it and reading exactly the same thing off one frame. The Queen asked. The Princess Royal said no. And then she took the other woman's hand in front of witnesses and walked her into the room the Queen had been trying to keep her out of. That is what moved the country. Not a scandal, not a leak, not a shouting match. A hand, a door, and a woman left standing under an arch. One image that needed no caption at all. The palace confirmed the substance and nothing else. An official statement described an expanded continuity briefing for the Princess of Wales and made one point clearly on the record. Camilla keeps her public program and all of her charitable commitments. No title changed. The line of succession did not move by a single name. Camilla saw it across the front page before anyone in the household reached her to explain. At first, it felt like pure exposure. Then she noticed the detail that softened it. Catherine had not turned back in triumph, had not raised her head, had not given any photographer a single frame that could be sold as a defeat, and felt no pleasure in the attention either. In a recorded conversation with a senior aide, she said duty often looks cruel from the outside because the warnings and the private appeals and the failed chances that came before, it all stay hidden. The public saw one walk toward one door. They did not see the months of interference that forced her hand. Then a national broadcaster opened its evening report with the line that turned that photograph into a verdict. The Princess Royal had drawn a line inside the House of Windsor. Overnight, Anne stopped being the woman escorting somebody down a hallway and became the family member who had ended something. Outside the palace, a crowd gathered beneath the balcony, holding newspapers and calling Catherine's name. One handmade sign rose above the others with 3 words on it: strength without revenge. That caught the mood of the country better than any of the coverage, because the crowd had noticed exactly what Camilla noticed in that photograph. Charles read all of it with quiet concern, and William understood the danger of letting one photograph define everything. But the verdict was already set by then. Anne had stopped fear from running the crown. Catherine took more responsibility without taking revenge for it. Charles finally chose one painful decision over another 6 months of silence, and Camilla lost the power to obstruct another woman while keeping every title she has. Catherine walked out of that throne room carrying knowledge. She knows what she would have to do during an illness, an absence, or a national emergency, and she knows it now rather than on the worst day of her life. If you want to understand why William pushed so hard for something as unglamorous as a briefing, remember what happened the last time this family put a woman in front of the cameras without preparing her for what it would do to her. He was 15 years old when he watched how that ended. He buttoned a dark suit and walked behind it through the streets of London while the entire world stood there watching him do it. He was never going to let his wife stand in that position unprepared. Not once. Not for anybody's comfort. Camilla continued her public work with the limits now drawn around it. She can support her charities, attend her engagements, and stand beside the king for as long as his reign lasts. She cannot touch Catherine's schedule, her access, or her preparation ever again. Charles apologized to both women without hiding behind tradition and admitted that his silence had let the mistrust grow for months. Anne told Catherine that walking her through those doors was never an endorsement of ambition. It was recognition that responsibility has to reach the person expected to carry it, and she would have done exactly the same thing if the names had been reversed. The crimson folder went to the royal archives, where the crown keeps the documents it never intended to explain. Camilla made the last gesture on her own. She returned the altered placement card to Catherine and said it represented the resentment she was ready to let go of. Charles is still king and still working. He stated in a video message this year that his treatment could be reduced in 2026 following early diagnosis and by following his doctor's instructions, and he called it a personal blessing. So the underlying question has not gone away. It has only moved a few years further down the road. That is the only thing a plan like this one can do, which leaves Camilla exactly where this story found her. She won the fight everyone swore she would never win. She got Charles. She endured the hatred, the scandals, and the polls. The crown was placed on her own head. But the crown was never what was being decided here. What was being decided was who would prepare for the next reign, and who would be left with the paperwork afterward. Anne answered that, in a corridor, without raising her voice, in about 9 words. Camilla keeps her title for exactly as long as Charles is alive, not 1 day beyond it. She heard that in the silence, and she understood it, standing alone beneath an archway, watching 2 women walk toward a door she no longer had permission to open. Thank you for watching. If you took something from this video, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel.